morning of April 25th, 1846. The north bank of the Rio Grande. A patrol of 63 United States Army dragoons under Captain Seth Thornton is riding through a thicket of chaparral about 20 miles upriver from the new American fort at Matamoros. They are looking for a small Mexican force that may or may not have crossed onto territory the United States claims as its own. There is no Mexican force ahead of them. There are 1,600 Mexican cavalry behind them and on both sides, and along the riverbank, cutting off retreat. The ambush is over in less than an hour. 11 Americans are killed. The rest are captured. Captain Thornton, his horse shot out from under him, is taken prisoner with the survivors. 2,000 miles away in Washington, President James K. Polk has been waiting for exactly this kind of news. He has not been hiding it. American blood has been shed on American soil. This is the story of the doctrine that wanted a war. Welcome back to the Western Ledger. I'm Lamar. Last time we watched the Republic of Texas lower its flag for the last time on a February afternoon in Austin. 9 years and 2 months and 8 days of independent existence ended in a single sentence. The Republic was no more. 9 weeks later, American and Mexican blood was spilling along the Rio Grande over the question of where exactly Texas now ended. The answer, when it came, would take half of Mexico into the United States. This is the story of manifest destiny and the war it walked America into. The phrase had a birth date. It appeared in the summer of 1845 in an essay published in a New York political magazine called The Democratic Review. The author was a 32-year-old journalist named John L. O'Sullivan. The essay was arguing for the annexation of Texas, a question Congress had been debating for nearly a decade, and that O'Sullivan thought had become absurd. Other nations, he wrote, were interfering with the United States in order to limit the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. It was a clumsy sentence. It was also the phrase that named the half-century to come. The idea, of course, was older than the phrase. It traced back at least to Thomas Jefferson, who in 1803 had purchased from Napoleon Bonaparte more than 800,000 square miles of French Louisiana for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States overnight and giving the new republic, in Jefferson's words, room enough for the 1,000th and 1,000th generation. It traced through the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, in which Spain gave up Florida and acknowledged a southwestern boundary that put Texas firmly in Spanish hands, a boundary the United States never quite accepted. It traced through the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, in which the United States declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization, a declaration the United States had no actual power to enforce, but which sounded enough like a statement of inevitability that it became one. And it traced through something older than any of these, a religious strain in American thought that went back to the Puritans and that saw the spread of American institutions and American people as something that wasn't just political ambition. It was providential. It was providential. It was God's plan. O'Sullivan's contribution was not the idea. His contribution was the phrase that turned it from a vague feeling into a slogan. When O'Sullivan wrote those words in the summer of 1845, Texas was on the verge of joining the Union. By December, it was in. And the doctrine that had been quietly motoring American expansion since the Louisiana Purchase suddenly had a name. Manifest destiny. The next question, which Polk had run on in 1844 and won by less than 2%, was where the United States stopped. Polk's answer was that it didn't. Texas was in the Union. Oregon was on the table with Britain. California was sitting in Mexican hands, undefended and unprofitable for Mexico, and within reach of any American president willing to take it. Polk was willing. There was a problem with the boundary. When the United States admitted Texas as the 28th state in December of 1845, it did not just inherit a piece of territory. It inherited an argument about where that territory ended. The argument had been going on for 10 years. The Republic of Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern border, a claim grounded in the treaties Santa Anna had signed under duress as a prisoner after San Jacinto. Mexico, which had never ratified those treaties and which had never recognized Texan independence in the first place, insisted that the Texan boundary had always been the Nueces River, 150 miles further north. The strip of land between the two rivers was almost empty. A few Hispanic ranches, a few cattle herds, no towns of any size, no formal administration by either government for most of the previous decade. The Republic of Texas had never actually controlled it. Mexico had never quite given it up. When Polk became president in March of 1845, he decided which river was the border without waiting for anyone to agree with him. It would be the Rio Grande. He ordered General Zachary Taylor, commander of what the administration called the Army of Observation, to move into Texas and prepare to defend it. By the autumn of 1845, Taylor had assembled 3,500 regular U.S. troops at Corpus Christi on the north bank of the Nueces, the boundary Mexico recognized. Then, in January of 1846, Polk gave Taylor an order that changed everything. He instructed the army to leave Corpus Christi and march south across 150 miles of disputed territory to the Rio Grande. He instructed Taylor to take up a position on the north bank of that river, directly across from the Mexican city of Matamoros, and to build a fort there. He renamed the unit the Army of Occupation. It was provocation by design. Taylor reached the Rio Grande on March 28th. He selected ground directly opposite the Mexican town, broke earth on a star-shaped fortification soon known as Fort Texas, and aimed 18 pieces of artillery across the river at Matamoros. Mexican families on the south bank watched American cannon being trained on their houses. At the same moment, in Mexico City, an American diplomat named John Slidell was being turned away from the Mexican government. Polk had sent Slidell south in November of 1845 with an extraordinary offer. The United States would forgive the $3 million in damage claims it held against Mexico, settle the Texas border at the Rio Grande, and pay up to $30 million additional dollars for the cession of New Mexico and California. The Mexican government refused even to receive him. The political situation in Mexico City was unstable, the public mood was furiously anti-American, and no Mexican president could survive being seen selling more territory to the United States after losing Texas. In late March, Slidell left Mexico without ever being officially heard. By the time he reached Washington, Taylor's cannon were already pointed at Matamoros. Polk had now placed an American army on disputed ground, refused diplomatic alternatives by design, and was waiting for the inevitable response. In April, the response came. The news from the Rio Grande reached Washington on the evening of May 9th, 1846. A military express rider had carried Taylor's dispatch east in 14 days, riding through South Texas swamps and across the lower Mississippi by steamboat, then overland through Alabama and Georgia and Virginia and into the capital. Taylor's report was matter of fact. A patrol under Captain Thornton had been ambushed by Mexican cavalry on the north bank of the Rio Grande. 11 Americans dead, the rest captured. Taylor expected a Mexican attack on Fort Texas at any moment. President Polk had been planning his war message for 2 weeks. In the days before the news arrived, he had already been drafting a justification for a war he intended to ask for whether or not Mexico fired first. The American claims against Mexico for damage to American shipping, the refusal to receive Slidell, the unsettled border, the prospect of British interest in California. Polk had been writing a case in his diary and on cabinet paper. The Thornton ambush did not create his message. It improved it. On Sunday, May 10th, the morning after the news arrived, Polk worked at his desk through the day, breaking only to attend church. He emerged with a sentence that would carry the country into war. On the afternoon of Monday, May 11th, 1846, Polk delivered his war message to a joint session of Congress. The center of the message was a single claim, simple and devastating. Mexico, Polk said, had crossed the boundary of the United States, had invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. The phrasing was deliberate. It was also misleading. The territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande was disputed land, not American soil by any definition Mexico would have recognized, or by any definition that the United States itself had ever maintained before Polk's presidency. American blood had certainly been shed. Whether it had been shed on American soil was the entire question the war was about to settle by force. The Bill of War passed the House of Representatives on May 11th by a vote of 174 to 14. It passed the Senate on May 12th by a vote of 40 to 2. President Polk signed the declaration of war on Wednesday, May 13th, 1846. The margins of the votes are misleading. Many of the men who voted yes did not believe the war was necessary. They believed that voting against an active military engagement with American soldiers already under fire on the Rio Grande was political suicide. The war bill came packaged with the appropriations to supply Taylor's army. Voting against the war meant voting to leave American soldiers in the field unfunded. That made the practical choice almost impossible for any politician hoping to be re-elected. Polk had not just engineered the war, he had engineered the vote. Within a month of the declaration, the United States raised an army of 50,000 volunteers. Most of them came from the southern and western states. Most of them had never seen Mexico, never seen the Rio Grande, never met a Mexican civilian. Most of them believed, because their newspapers and their preachers told them so, that they were going to fight for the cause of liberty against a Catholic despotism. The country that had just admitted Texas was about to take everything else. But not everyone in Washington was prepared to be quiet about it. The war that Polk had engineered passed Congress on May 13, 1846. The protest began before the ink was dry. 14 Whig congressmen had voted against the war bill. Among them was John Quincy Adams, former president, then 79 years old, who would die on the House floor 22 months later, having opposed every expansion measure of the past 2 decades to his last conscious moment. A year and a half after the Declaration, on December 22nd of 1847, a tall, gangling freshman Whig congressman from Illinois rose at his desk and submitted 8 written resolutions to the House. He was 38 years old. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's resolutions did not call for ending the war or condemning Polk. They simply asked the president, formally and on the record, to identify the exact spot of ground on which American blood had been shed upon American soil, and to provide the evidence that the spot in question was, in fact, American. They became known as the Spot Resolutions. Polk ignored them. The Illinois newspapers branded Lincoln a traitor. 2 years later, he chose not to run for re-election. He would be useful later. In a small Massachusetts town the previous summer, a 30-year-old writer named Henry David Thoreau had refused to pay his poll tax, 6 years in arrears, as a personal protest against a government waging an unjust war and protecting human slavery. He spent one night in the Concord jail. His aunt, against his wishes, paid the tax in the morning and got him released. The night in jail was enough. Thoreau went home and wrote an essay. It was published 2 years later under the title Resistance to Civil Government. It would be reprinted after his death under the title that has carried its argument to every continent: Civil Disobedience. In Rochester, New York, the abolitionist editor Frederick Douglass watched the war from his desk at the North Star and named what he was seeing. The war, he wrote, was disgraceful, cruel, and iniquitous. Mexico had become a doomed victim to Anglo-Saxon cupidity and love of dominion. And among the volunteers themselves, marching south with Taylor's army toward Matamoros, was a quiet 24-year-old lieutenant from Ohio named Ulysses Grant. Grant did his duty. He fought well in the battles to come. Decades later, dying of cancer and writing the memoirs that would become a classic of American letters, he set down what he had concluded. The war he had fought in, he wrote, was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. He believed the Civil War, 20 years later, was God's punishment for it. Within a month of the declaration, Taylor's regulars defeated a Mexican army twice their size at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma on the disputed Texas Plain. The Southern campaign was underway. Within 6 months, Stephen Watts Kearny had marched the Army of the West out of Fort Leavenworth across 2,000 miles of prairie and high desert and taken Santa Fe without firing a shot. New Mexico was American. Within a year, John Fremont and a handful of California settlers had raised the Bear flag over Sonoma. The United States Navy had seized Monterey and San Francisco. California was American. Within 2 years, the American flag would fly over the National Palace in Mexico City. The war Polk had wanted was about to give him everything he had wanted. Next time, Palo Alto, Buena Vista, Veracruz, Chapultepec. America's forgotten conquest. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. I'll see you there.